you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village, which this week will largely be your shelter from the tiresome blizzard of Gamescom news. I'm joined by the unconventional Ian Hardingham.
Hello, Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I've become free to play since we last met, so be prepared for some bizarre paywalls today.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
PlayStation Home, Sony's attempt at total brand immersion, was surprisingly successful according to a report by Kotaku. The service generated a reasonable profit for the company despite technical difficulties and a lack of awareness outside of a small but committed fan base. Ian Hardingham, what killed PlayStation Home, and did it deserve to die?
I was so intrigued to find out that it was profitable. You and I have had several meetings with the lovely people at PlayStation Home, usually at Develop, and we're always willing to have meetings. Anyone who asks, we tend to have meetings with them. So we certainly had meetings with PlayStation Home, and it sounded like one of Sony's kind of brand things. They seem to do a lot of things that aren't profitable, that somehow contribute to this general notion of the brand of Sony and PlayStation, and somehow, after a huge amount of weird math, end up being profitable through some other avenue. And I just always assumed it was one of those things. I'm pretty surprised to find out it's profitable.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because I think there's a kind of latent demand for virtual worlds that exists continuously, and certain kinds of virtual world crop up occasionally where they just get a sort of locked in critical mass of user base. So the reason that Home worked was that people were buying items. It says in this report that I think all of the items that were released were profitable in some way. And that's just a really interesting situation when you have a thing with like a locked-in community where people want to socialise and they want to have those status things, show stuff off, do weird stuff, then I think it can be profitable. But these things always seem to have this kind of weird lifespan, and I'm never quite sure why that is.
PlayStation Home was so commercial. Almost everything on there was about advertising one service, one game or another, and that, for me, would have really undermined it. I guess that consoles nowadays are really like a curated experience, sub-experience of computing in general. So if you want to have the PlayStation version of this weird community MMO thing, then PlayStation Home was attractive for that. And if you just love your PlayStation so much you wanted to keep interacting with it even when you didn't have any games to play, the whole thing's pretty boggling to me. I mean, I think it was really nice, but it was so much like... It reminded me a lot of the mall that's underground next to the big art gallery in Paris. You get off the tube and there's this weird mall. It's all about the expensive clothing lines, and then you get into this massive art museum, and it just felt completely out of place, and that's how I felt moving around PlayStation Home.
I guess there is a lot of the hanging out of the mall aspect to it. I mean, that we distinguish it from something like Second Life. And when I talk about Second Life, I'm kind of talking about pre-porn hell Second Life. So when Second Life was actually used by people for purposes other than the obvious things. It was this kind of really weird, interesting freeform. It was like the Linux of virtual worlds, and this is like the iOS of virtual worlds. It was very, like you say, very curated. It was very clinical. But thinking about it now, like if PlayStation Home existed, like I use my PS4 enough that I would walk around PlayStation Home. It was kind of meant to be this adjunct to games. So it was originally created for the Getaway, and it was supposed to be like this kind of a multiplayer hub thing, and they just found that it worked in a kind of generalized way. And I'm kind of sad to see it go. I think nobody really understood why it was good, and so now it's died.
Yeah, it's very unique because with MMOs, you either have completely no coherence at all, like Second Life, or a lot of the sort of fan-made MUDs, etc., or you have a very coherent experience like World of Warcraft. Unusual that you get something like PlayStation Home where everything on its own is created to a pretty high standard, but there's not very much coherence around the whole of the products. You could at one point be in a penthouse apartment with a swimming pool, the next moment be in a wood being chased by zombies. So there was something quite romantic about it, and in some ways it felt a little bit like a movie's version of an online world, where you're skipping in between all of these quite well-designed places that have nothing to do with each other otherwise.
My abiding memory of Home was at friend of the show, Binster's house. We were looking at it when it came out, and we were in a bowling alley, and there was a guy there, like, at the aisle next to us. You could see other people bowling, in my memory. And he was just idling, and just, like, his avatar just looked so weird, kind of standing stock still. And then there was another guy kind of making this noise, like, just really quietly in the bowling alley. So it was kind of like, it was like being in a bowling alley with some very disturbed people, and it was quite empty.
Yeah, it felt a bit like being in a Bret Easton Ellis book, like, occasionally, right. Which is awesome, but only for a few minutes at a time.
I've got a list of some of the things that you could buy in Home, and I'm just going to read these out. So you could buy a digital leisure aquarium, you could buy Amethyst Empress and Fire Opal Aristocrat, you could buy Steampunk Horse Locomotion and Clothing, you could buy Silky Blouse, and you could buy Carp Streamer Set.
Yeah, I think my reaction to that is to let the viewers know that we have a new producer on this show called James Hannett, and he's finding his way around his tasks, and it's his job to do some of the show notes for us. So it's always interesting to see what he's doing. So this list of things you could get in Home is one of the ways that he's branching out in production. This was actually written by me.
Oh no! And for the sole purpose of reading them out, James is he likes to create nicely crafted questions, and I've kind of just dropped that in at the end because I felt like it would be a good point to conclude. So we are still working things out, but I think we've done well. I think that's a fitting end. Kickstarter and Killscreen had a great article entitled 12 Questions on Game Design, which interviewed a variety of designers from Douglas Wilson of Johann Sebastian Joust fame to Peter Iwanicki, the creator of Superhot, which is amazing. We definitely recommend reading this article. Ian Hardingham, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, this was great. This is 5 or possibly 6 different game designers with hugely different approaches to game design. And I'm just going to read a very small excerpt. The question is asked, what's the biggest thing players just don't understand about game mechanics? And Michael Samin answers that game mechanics are not necessary for enjoyment, that in fact game mechanics distract from the joy and insight that interacting with virtual projects can bring, that players are addicted to being busy because they are afraid of death and of life. Palama Dawkins answers, nothing. The player knows everything. They know your game better than you do. Do it right the first time, then live with it. I could go on, I could read all the answers. Every single one is completely different. You can see the first person there is angry with game mechanics. They want to escape the fascist holdings of having to have a game define the experience that you're giving people. The second person is, I don't know exactly what kind of point they're making, but the interesting thing is that there is just no singular vision about game mechanics. You know, you could probably get a lot of people who make films and they would give you a similar idea of what plot is about. But with game mechanics, it's just a completely new medium.
I find this kind of difficult as someone who is largely kind of outside of design, although I suppose I'm kind of learning more about it and getting more involved with it these days. I do find it odd that people have this kind of very emotional reaction to stuff. I mean, I try to analogize out to other things I know. So I know some musicians kind of react emotionally to the idea of having a melody. Like if something has a catchy melody, then it's kind of cheesy and it's necessarily pop music. Or if something doesn't have a melody, it's sort of pointless, kind of experimental. You know, you can view all of those things negatively. But it's so weird to see people like be angry about game mechanics. It's not something I realised existed before. Are there people kind of creating these more kind of non-linear or exploratory experiences? Do they hate games? Do they hate game mechanics?
I suppose I can understand if you want to open everything up to an extreme extent, that you look at something like Mario or something like a strategy game or SimCity and you just say, this is such a tiny slice of what games can do. and yet, to put it bluntly, within this tiny slice is where all the money is being made.
Yeah.
All of the people care about it. That's where all the coverage is. I can understand that producing anger in people.
I suppose so, but then is that not kind of what games are? And then defining this sort of external space is always about challenging. I mean, you see the same in visual art. Like, there's a lot of tension between abstract and representative visual art, and then there's kind of experimental art which is trying to redefine it. Is that not kind of just a traditional tension? Are people not kind of over that yet?
Yeah, I guess so. There does seem to be a desire when the part of an art form you're practicing is not particularly popular. You say that it's because consumers aren't educated or because people are lazy, that kind of thing, which is, you know, true to a certain extent, but usually people are playing the kind of thing that they like, and it's your job to make your thing both really artistically valid and also accessible, which is the message that I would have for a lot of people who get angry about this kind of thing, that it's still their job to make a human want to play their amazing thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I still don't actually know to what extent games are defined by just what we've been playing so far and there's so much further to go, or whether we're starting to see some of the bounds about what people want to and don't want to do in games. It seems foolish to suggest that with how many new things happen every year. Just look at things like Minecraft and Terraria and how much they opened Pandora's box. But on the other hand, there are very, very strong themes running through all of these very successful games. And the person who was talking about how gamers feel like they need to be busy, there's such a fundamental feedback loop in human psychology about doing something and being rewarded for it, about tidying things up, all that kind of stuff. That may just be core to games.
I mean, I think to me a lot of the time mechanics are kind of just the grammar or the structure of the experience. So it's almost like you can't ever have no mechanics. So hating mechanics is just an odd thing to me. It is like hating structure.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we know that people will find it difficult to separate their hatred of popular versions of a thing with the thing itself, and people will often narrow down an idea, a concept like mechanics, to just represent the parts of it that they don't like, I guess.
PC Gamer had an article on humour in video games. Graham Linehan described humour as like comedy in porn. Ian Hardingham, is humour in games like comedy in porn?
I actually think that's both a really funny analogy and sort of somewhat true. It generally is something that is just part of the wallpaper and not a core part of the experience. I have to say, I have a slightly unusual opinion on this. I think comedy is a somewhat fundamentally uninteractive form, which is one of the reasons why it's been hard so far to get a lot more comedy in games. The interactive part of comedy tends to be making other people laugh, not yourself laugh. And it's something that you observe, and I am of the belief that laughing in humans is about being able to spot a mistake and being rewarded for it. And great comedy is about triggering that response in the right way in people. I'd be really interested to see a simulator where you were trying to make other people laugh, like a stand-up sim or something.
Oh, that'd be awesome, yeah.
Yeah, so I'd really like to see that, but I'm not actually that surprised. I'm not sure what people are looking for. You know, great comedy is really hard in a medium where you can get people to sit down and listen to your bit for 3 minutes. In a medium where you can't, it's going to be even harder.
I think there's some conflation that happens with the idea of humour in games, and there's probably two big camps. The first camp, I'd say, is, I guess I'd call it writing humour. So games that have gags in them that are funny, like Day of the Tentacle or The Stanley Parable. Then there's kind of play humour, and that would be stuff like Goat Simulator, where it's explicitly designed so that what the player is doing is funny. Maybe to a lesser extent, games in the sort of genre that Tom Francis works in, where it's very emergent. So a lot of the humour comes from experimentation and getting surprising results. I think surprise is a big component of humour, in addition to the error spotting thing, which you correctly identified. So I think people kind of conflate those two things. I think it's hard to get written humour into games a lot of the time, because to do that you have to have a formal structure to rail against, to undermine. You have to constantly do things that are sort of anti-authoritarian, and games are so much about, as we've just talked about, forcing people into a system. The other thing, on the other side, creating emergent humour through the player's actions, that can only be done in certain types of, again, very free-form game, and it's not something that the designer generally has a lot of control over. So I kind of want to see a bit more of a nuanced discussion of this now, because it's come up quite a few times, and I think people are just kind of smushing those two things together uncomfortably.
Yeah, I think you're right to make that distinction. I think that if games want to get better at comedy, they need to be more nuanced in the second. I think that the part of comedy that is pretty unique to games is laughing at the funny things that happen within games. And while people are starting to try and investigate games that are about broken games, I still think that you could have some actually really, really great humour where they're playing on that a little bit, and more of it is intended than you think. But and that's how they're making you laugh. But it's a less obvious thing.
Yeah, I think intention is very difficult to separate out, because a lot of the time, some of the funniest games are things like Boiling Point, where stuff just doesn't work, and that's just about failure. Like it's about trying to undermine a kind of lofty ambition. It's about sniping kind of pretentiousness in some ways, looking at these elaborate systems going wrong. And whether you can ever kind of... I haven't played Jazzpunk, but I think Jazzpunk is kind of an interesting way of trying to bring that into reality. And Goat Sim, again, where it's kind of... They just left a lot of the bugs in. They just made it not crash, and then left you to have to deal with all the stuff. I think that's kind of an interesting way of going for emergent humour. Ralph Costa has an interesting blog post about the extent to which designers should be concerned about the impact of their games, both in terms of addiction and also their social impact. Ian Hardingham, should designers really worry about this?
I don't know is the answer to that. I mean, I make relatively clean strategy games that certainly don't go towards the fringes of what's morally questionable or legally questionable in the art form, so it's not something that I feel like I have to worry about particularly. But he makes a couple of good points. He talks about how addiction can be bad, getting into an emotional relationship with someone in an online game, and then that going wrong can be bad. Both of which are true. It's a very nice article, but he basically answers every question that he has with no, you don't have to worry about it. It's something to think about and to understand, just like as humans we should think about everything we do and how that impacts other human beings. But I think within the broad guidelines of what games are right now, you probably don't have to feel too morally bad about making those things.
What do you think about explicitly designing games to be addictive? Like, your ideal situation is that people are genuinely playing them perhaps more than is healthy in a balanced lifestyle.
So I guess with anything else, games are really the only thing that you can sort of do over and over again and play for hundreds and hundreds of hours, whereas obviously you reach the end of a book or you reach the end of a film, or there's only so many times you can listen to a particular pop track. I think that is the most interesting question here, although given that, as we said earlier, trying to foster some kind of addiction is a pretty big part of making games. I think that it would be very hard to try and make something addictive, but not too addictive. And none of us want to have game time limits imposed by the government or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's probably about, as a wider society, understanding that there are people who are prone to this kind of thing and helping them, rather than limiting yourself as a designer.
I think that's probably true. Something that I've kind of found difficult to reconcile is the recent emphasis on the creator's responsibility for social outcomes versus my general belief that people should be allowed to create what they want and then society has to cope with it because that's how art certainly functions. So I think to the point at which you're trying to... I mean, there's gambling games, there's sort of the borderline gambling F2P games which are about basically monetizing addiction. They're trying to very actively put people into a state where they are receiving an undue amount of emotional payback from things. Is that something that kind of designers should be dealing with? I think it probably is, but I think probably only in those very extreme cases. And then further down the line, if you're making a game which is sort of addictive and good, it really is about how people process that. I mean, it's obviously different when there are children involved, and there should be obviously appropriate age ratings around, things like gambling and free to play. That's been dealt with. But I really just feel like we need to get back to a situation where society is the thing that's being held to be responsible. I guess you'd agree with that.
I've recently become a father, and one of the first things I learned is that every single thing in the world is something that you have to worry about whether your child is doing too much or too little of. So I have become even less sympathetic with the sort of question about whether games need to be severely limited or are amoral because of the children. As someone who occasionally would kill himself if he didn't have BBC cartoons to keep the child happy for half an hour, these things can be extremely useful as well as a parent. So on that sub issue, the entire of parenthood is trying to limit something that your kids enjoy as you are teaching them how much is appropriate for something. So I find that sort of relatively irrelevant. I think with addiction, it is really tough. I mean, there's nothing I like more than being addicted to a game to the extent that I'm actually happy to play it for an hour on a bus ride. I have downtime when I can read a book or I can play a game that I'm really enjoying. For younger people who have enough time that they could actually play a game for 10 hours a day, and who have personalities for whom they'll be choosing to do that rather than to go and do things which might be better for them in the long terms, I think that's a problem. But again, how you spend your time, if it's not taking away your money like gambling is, or if it's not a drug that's actively hurting you or possibly others around you, that's a really tough thing. We don't want to live in a nanny state that says you can't play World of Warcraft more than 3 hours a day, I don't think, because a lot of us are adults who can play World of Warcraft for 10 hours one day and then not for 2 weeks. So I guess I don't worry about it, because I agree with you that I think it's society's job to work it out.
A relevant topic now. Angry Birds 2, or Angry Birds 12 if you go by the actual number of games released, thanks James, came out earlier this week and has moved to an F2P model. The amount of randomization per level has increased, meaning that levels can be rolled which are impossible to complete without playing. Ian Hardingham, how unacceptable is this?
This is extremely unacceptable. I love Angry Birds 1. It's a really, really great game. And despite the fact that it's one of the poster children of mobile games, it's also not an F2P game on any level. It has a good demo, and it has a full app that you buy for $1 or $2 or whatever it is, and they've given you loads of updates, and it's about one of the most generous things possible. It is a pay-once game. Not only do I object to a lot of things about free-to-play, but the thing that upsets me most is when free-to-play considerations destroy game mechanics in a game. And you are looking at Angry Birds 2 having messed around with some of the fundamental things that make Angry Birds 1 really good. Instead of having a set lineup of birds to attack a level with, now, the majority of the time, they're random birds. So you have different experiences playing through the level different times. You've got different weapons, basically. And while I think that might be an interesting idea on its own, all of the things that have gone into this process, much more randomization, as you say, are just about making it easier to charge people money. The whole thing's just disgusting.
It would be really interesting to see what's working from this, because this violates so many of the principles of good F2P game design. There's quite a lot that's known about this kind of model, particularly the kind of things that they're doing now. And this kind of thing where the game is just fluctuatingly unfair arbitrarily, and you're paying to compensate from that, that just breaks every kind of conventional idea that people have about this now. So they're trying something which is against the common knowledge and seems bad. Whether they have the flexibility with this game to iterate all of that away if it genuinely, doesn't work, is interesting. Like, maybe they're kind of really committed to the structure. It sounds like bad gameplay. It sounds like bad F2P. I was talking to guru of F2P monetization, Nicholas Lovell, and he said something that really interests me. He said that when you're getting the player to pay, you have to associate that process with something enjoyable. If they're having to pay every time to overcome an inconvenience, or they're getting hit with something, it makes paying negative, so they won't want to pay more in the future. People are quite aware of how monetization works now, and there are people who are used to playing these games. So if you're just offending them and making the payment not fun, then that's surely got to be a bad thing.
Yeah, it seems like every month now we have a new free-to-play game released, and the main storyline is that it's actually found a better way of being free-to-play, a more intelligent way. I read the articles about these games, I think, well, that makes sense. That's what's better than what's come before. It's just completely bizarre that Angry Birds 2 would come out and feel like a free-to-play game released in 2010, because you think these guys are smart. I don't really understand it. I mean, they had one free-to-play thing in the original Angry Birds, which is that you could pay to skip levels. And it's not something that I ever did. I thought it was kind of an amusing idea for a free-to-play thing. So they have kind of dipped their toe in the water before. They've gone completely into overdrive on this. I guess Angry Birds is too big to fail in the short term, but I don't know where this is going in the medium term.
The problem also that I have with things like this is that we can never know whether this was good or not, because they will never put out any information that leads us to understand that until the point at which they decide to shut down the game, which might be 5 years in the future, by which point everyone will have forgotten and it might have become unrecognisable from what it was at the start. So there isn't this ease of information. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people involved with F2P design could listen to what we're saying and say, oh, those guys don't know anything, and like, this clearly will be fine, and certain customers will be turned off, but the majority will be fine. Like, we can't know that because we don't have any data, and that's still the thing I find most frustrating about F2P. All I can say is that I think this sounds bad.
The problem is that even if we had the data, even if we knew how much money they were taking in and their basic player numbers, because it's such an unbelievably successful game, I just don't know if we'd understand what the baseline for what would be successful and what would not be successful is. I mean, Angry Birds 2, a game released called Angry Birds 2 that was generally competent, stands to make an insanely high amount of money.
Yeah.
It's just almost impossible to know whether this has hurt it in any way, whether it's too big a brand to fail, and maybe whether it actually worked.
I mean, I think there are also some other examples, things like Candy Crush, where the F2P is pretty bad by a lot of standards. The other thing with this is that it seems to violate the idea that it should be possible to play the game kind of infinitely for free. Like, it really isn't possible to play this game infinitely for free. If you roll a level where you don't have the right birds, or the configuration of the level is sufficiently hard that you can't win, then you have to pay money, and that just seems, again, wrong. So maybe they're just trying to challenge these things. Maybe they've come out of the gate with something that kind of is violating all these principles to go, well, do these things actually matter?
I mean, given that it's Angry Birds 12, technically, I wonder if they were seeing significantly diminished returns on their last titles. And maybe they actually felt a real impetus to keep their yearly revenue up, that they had to do something completely different. It's possible, I suppose, although it would be surprising, that Angry Birds Star Wars was a sort of relative failure in their eyes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not that one. It just, it's so difficult to know. These companies aren't very forthcoming with this information. And I guess the only thing to do is for people to constantly watch this on the iTunes chart and let us know if you're into such things. I know some people are, then please do. Everybody's gone to the Rapture. The next game from Dear Esther developers The Chinese Room comes out early next week. There was a trailer for this, but it's mysteriously been made private, so we can't link you to it. Intriguing. Ian Harding, and where do walking simulators fit now that they are an established genre?
I guess as an established genre. I've played one. I think you've played several. You've played a lot more than me. I've played Dear Esther. Yep. I may play the next one that sounds good, although because I feel like I have such a I feel like I know what I'm going to get from them, even if what I'm going to get is a very surprising story with some twists. It feels very much like the decision of whether or not I'm going to rent a specific film or not, which I find harder to sort of bring myself to do, even if I'm relatively excited by something. So I don't think it's a big genre for me, but obviously it is very popular.
I'm interested to see where this is going, because I think a lot of people are bringing out games like this now. I've certainly heard of a lot in development, and a lot of people talk about sort of Dear Esther and Gone Home as this big touchstone of this kind of new wave of narrative games. I actually think VR is probably one of the most important things for walking simulators, because they are the genre which suit VR best. Very low interaction, very high emphasis on environment and player experience. This kind of looks interesting. It seems like they've sort of doubled down on the Dear Esther idea, so these very, very elaborate environments, doesn't look like much interaction is happening. There looks like quite a lot of voice acting and story going into this. It's just a kind of weird thing. It feels like a retrogressive genre, because originally, obviously, FPSs started out being quite highly interactive, and then people added stuff, more things that you could do. You had the first-person kind of action RPG thing. And now we've gone right back, all the way back to not being able to do anything, to these linear experiences, and I find that quite curious.
Yeah, I still don't know if it is going to be an established genre long term or not. It's pretty popular right now. I don't know if FMV is going to have an impact. FMV's in the ascendancy right now, and it's something that could barge in on walking simulators land, as it were. So I guess I just don't know. I didn't really like the trailer I watched of this. It had it just looked a bit boring, but I guess that's not relevant.
I guess Alien Isolation is kind of a cross between an FPS and a walking simulator. Like some of those kind of more survival-y games, it certainly has walking simulator elements to it.
Yeah, I think that's the crossover, and another game by the Chinese Room, the A Machine for Pigs.
Yeah,
and those other horror games. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's real DNA sharing there.
It is intriguing. I kind of await. I think Dear Esther was revolutionary. Gone Home was revolutionary. I'm really waiting for. I suppose Stanley Parable as well was another kind of shift, but I'm waiting for the next thing which is going to change this, and I'm not getting those vibes from this actually. I'm getting this kind of this is like Dear Esther 2 from this. Although they've changed some things up, and I don't know what the next thing is. Maybe it's more of the cross-pollination stuff that's going to really take this and make it interesting. GB Burford had an article over at Kotaku about 3 things that made Fallout 3 special. Ian Hardingham, this seems like it would appeal to you. Does Fallout 3 deserve a special place in our hearts?
I think the question of Fallout 3 versus Fallout New Vegas is a truly interesting one, and I hope to see even more articles on the subject. It's been obviously in the news a lot recently with Fallout 4 being announced, but this article really talks specifically from the direction of how good New Vegas is, and how the writer feels that Fallout 3 is now underrated. One of the things from this that I want to pick on is the quality of the open world in Fallout 3. As he correctly says, Bethesda have done an amazing job where you never go too far in the big open world without coming across something really interesting, something really bizarre. And that's how you do open world brilliantly, when you put so much effort into making every corner of it well designed. And that's really important, and that's something that New Vegas definitely doesn't do. And basically, you can find people for whom that's a good thing, and you can find people for whom that is also a bad thing, that they like the much larger, much more expansive thing where you feel like you're lost in the place and it doesn't feel as curated. So that's just one example of where I think it's most interesting discussing these games in contrast to each other.
I haven't actually played New Vegas, and it is something that I need to do, but from what I've heard about it, it does seem to have this kind of increased density, this increased kind of narrative concentration, whereas Fallout 3 was really about, they tried to go for a bit of the original Fallout feel, where you could wander around and then you'd happen upon a very highly developed narrative system, but it would just be kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. And I think that is actually something that's really lacking. I can't think of if you look at the Elder Scrolls games, those are so bland that you kind of don't notice that happening. Fallout 3 definitely skewed towards this more kind of, you could come across this really interesting thing at any time feeling. And I miss that. I do think we need this kind of open world that isn't afraid of being boring, which is one of the points he makes, where there's just large areas which are kind of dull, but then suddenly sort of you'll find something in those areas. I feel like we're going too much towards the crafted open world.
I think Fallout 3 is the most mainstream version of Fallout, if you will. It's got a big, high budget central plot line. It's got a big, expensive actor. It's trying to have the best of both worlds. It's trying to be good for the now generation as well as giving you exploration, trying to take the accessible elements of Fallout 3. An example of that is that, Fallout in general, is that Fallout 3, the thing that I like about it least is that I think it really fails at being dark. It's kind of really just doesn't have the subtlety, and Fallout New Vegas does. And that's another one of the examples of where they differ. It was such a mainstream approach, and it was really nice to get New Vegas straight afterwards, which was really a completely different take on what Fallout 3 could have been. So I do prefer New Vegas. I think it's a funner, more immersive game, and it's definitely more replayable. I start it every sort of 6 months. I start a campaign of Fallout New Vegas because it's so much more exciting. And, you know, Fallout 3, it's the first thing you've got is Megaton, which sounded good in marketing materials, the city you could choose to blow up, but kind of ended up slightly representing some of the things that were wrong with Fallout 3. It was too scripted, it was sort of too silly, and actually it wasn't really dark enough, despite the fact that it was about blowing up a whole city with a nuclear bomb. So yeah, my loyalties lie with Fallout New Vegas.
Yeah, I didn't like Megaton that much, actually, and it is something that people kind of cite as a highlight. And I do slightly think there is a little bit of the old rose tint going on with Fallout 3. Like, some parts of the early game of Fallout 3 are really bad, and it really does take you a while until you kind of actually get out there and you have the capacity to sort of survive a bit, that you can do the kind of interesting exploration. The first bit going through the childhood thing and then out to there, it really does take a very long time, and it's quite stodgy. I think we're going to see this interesting tension in future between stuff like this, which is kind of the more traditional narrative side, and the kind of No Man's Sky approach. They've been talking recently more about how there is this kind of open exploration, but there are factions that you can annoy by doing certain things. And it's this trying to keep this very open thing where you're interacting with these bigger systems. Is something that's interesting. I don't know if No Man's Sky is going to achieve that. It would be cool to see what they do, if they do anything interesting along those lines. But I think that's where the tension is. It's the procedural kind of systemic approach versus this narrative approach. And I think you're right. I think Fallout 3 was trying to be all things to all men. One actual bit of Gamescom news now, and it's to do with the mechanic in Hearthstone of all things. Blizzard have introduced a mechanic called Reveal, which is a card effect that allows you to see cards in your opponent's hands. That is quite literally a game changer if they use it in the way that it's been advertised. Ian Hardingham, what do you think about the direction Hearthstone is going and about these card games in general?
Yeah, so I play a little bit of Magic the Gathering, and Visiting the Village Magic expert Tom Richards has plays it an awful lot and is trying to get up to a pro standard. So I talk a lot about the game design of that and Hearthstone with him. Something that's really interesting about this card. Now, this card basically says once you play it, each player reveals basically a chosen card from their deck. And if the one that you reveal has a higher mana cost, you get this bonus. So it's a really interesting mechanic because it's basically saying, do I want to reveal my really important, great, expensive card? And there's kind of a little bit of gamey gambling going on there, which is brilliant and quite fully formed out of the box as a mechanic. And I think that's really showing one of the things that Blizzard are willing to do with Hearthstone, which I don't think Wizards do as much with Magic. Have some more metagame elements that are kind of obvious straight from the card description. I think that in Magic they prefer to have more basic rules that eventually combine to create some of these interesting meta stuff, whereas I think Blizzard are playing a lot more. One of the other major differences, which I don't think is talked about enough, is that Hearthstone can do a bunch of things that Magic can't do, because Hearthstone's on the computer, and things like shuffling your deck take no time at all. A lot of Hearthstone's card mechanics are things they'd never put into Magic, because every time you do it, you have to reshuffle the entire deck, and that takes a long time. So that's another aspect of that.
That's a good point, actually. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, they need all of the Magic kind of additions to be compatible with the hardware version. And Hearthstone doesn't have those constraints. I like this change because it makes Hearthstone more about the game elements, and I always think in limited information games it's fun to have information trading mechanics, certainly, which is what this is. There's a lot of that in the high level kind of limited information games, where you will deliberately show something, maybe in exchange to get some information or to bluff and so on. So that's very interesting. I think still Hearthstone has this problem for me as someone who played it originally and kind of is slightly getting back into it now, which is that I don't really want new stuff to be added because I'm so far behind. Like, I don't even know about the first expansion that came out for Hearthstone yet, so I'm still catching up with that. So as they change these rules and add them, oddly it sort of alienates kind of newer players more, because it feels like there's more that you have to catch up with. And I don't know if they've completely taken that into account, or indeed if newer players care coming into Hearthstone. Hearthstone's a pretty intimidating game to get into now, to be honest.
Well, whenever I talk about these games, I'm always reminded that Frozen Synapse was designed to be a game that you didn't have to learn the metagame of, that had rules that were simple, that you would sort of just be creative as you played. And that is certainly something that turns me off as well. You basically have to be a full-time subscriber, certainly to Magic and to a slightly lesser degree Hearthstone, to have any idea what the current best decks are and to play competitively. And it does, in this age of being able to play against anyone at any time, it does feel annoying if you can only have a good time playing against really new people. Like, I played a bit of Rocket League last night, and I bet that's fun, no matter what standard people you're playing against. So it's certainly a negative. I just... we're so used to games being accessible right now and being something you pick up and play straight away and get really excited by, because that's what is very popular, that we just have to understand that some of these games aren't meant to be like that, and you have to really invest some time.
We're now going to move on from games into this little area of the show that I like to call the Movie and Television Annex. Probably going to change its name every week as I forget its name. Anyway, in we go. The creator of Cinemax's Banshee has explained why he's ending the show. He wrote an article on Grantland to say why they've decided to cancel it. Due to the difficult nature of getting a show started on US TV, where there is a strong incentive to keep shows going, even if that means changing what the show is about and perhaps compromising the story that they were trying to tell to begin with. So, Ian Hardingham, does this tell us anything interesting about the nature of TV in this day and age?
So, the Jonathan Tropper, who created Banshee, he is going to call an end to the series after 4 seasons. And traditionally, with a show this successful, it would probably go at least 5, sometimes 6. And that's basically a big deal. If you're a showrunner on a really successful show, Banshee's a great show, it's very cult, it's really, really popular. Giving that up to basically jump back in the Shark Tank and try and create a new property is a bold move, at the very least. There's an element of this that I want to focus on, though, which is directly in contrast to games. If you're a game studio, maybe you're Rocksteady and you decide you don't want to make Batman games anymore, then you will largely use the same team of people to make your next game. If you're a showrunner and you basically cancel a show, you are putting a load of people out of work. A huge number of people on the ground in the place where you do the majority of your filming, obviously all of the actors, and that must be really, really difficult. I'm not sure what I think about this guy. I think that if you're employing a lot of people with your creativity, then going an extra 2 years would be good. But on the other hand, I understand him saying that all of the ideas they had for the hypothetical 5th and 6th seasons would have been against the original ideas of the show and would have been substandard. So that's a really tough question.
I have a strong opinion on this. I think that people who create TV shows who are in this kind of role, I don't think it's up to them whether they cancel them or not. Like, I don't think you, as a creator, have the right to say this has to end now, because a lot of the time when shows outstay their welcome, they start to get really weird and they produce some really memorable TV, even if it's really bad TV. I understand people not wanting to be associated with things that are bad, that's fine, but I think creatively, like, one of the interesting things about TV is that you're creating a format. You're not necessarily creating a story. A story can last over a season, or it can be part of the kind of atmospheric general background of a show if it's an overarching plot. But you're not, unless you're doing something very, very specific, which I don't think Banshee is. Not that I've seen Banshee, but I've read about it. I don't think it's that constrained as to what it could potentially be. Then I think you should just let it go. Like, maybe you should leave and let everyone else carry on and get a new showrunner in to do something interesting. I find this a bit sort of selfish.
Well, that's interesting, because I was with you for most of that. But there are a few things in entertainment that I hate more than the main guy behind a show I like leaving and having to deal with the fact that the resulting show with someone else is basically uniformly much worse. Certainly much worse for me. It often happens when they want to make the show accessible to a different group of people, and that's fine. It might be better for those people, but it's certainly not as good for me. So I kind of don't like shows that extend that far. Yeah, I mean, if you've run out of things to say and you had this plot arc and now you have to extend it in this weird way, it does end up being terrible, and maybe you have to pretend that an entire season of your show was a dream by one of the minor characters, which is a great thing to have happened. I don't know. I think that's an interesting, strong call on your part, though.
Yeah, I guess I just don't respect TV as anything, you know, unless it's a really exceptional show. It is mostly just about being entertaining. And I think things can be entertaining if they go off the rails, if they radically change direction, or if they stop making sense. And you will upset fans, but upsetting fans is kind of part and parcel of creating TV anyway. So I just feel like it's kind of a limitation. And also, it's so hard to get anything that has any kind of traction on TV that it just feels like it's a bit of a nuclear option.
Yeah, this, again, just feels like the idea of whether you should sequel your hit game, as we were talking about last week, or whether you should do something else. It's similar kind of considerations there, similar risk, although I think in TV they're much less delusional about how likely their next project is to be successful.
Yeah.
On the other hand, TV still has the thing where other people will pay you to do your thing, the vast majority of the time. So as long as you can get your project signed, you can at least make the money to make it for a year, even if it's not then successful.
You can tell we're drawing close to the end of the show when we come out with a story like this. According to Variety, a deal has been made to make a movie based on the valuable Pez dispenser IP. No word yet on whether this will be coming to the silver or small screens first. Ian Hoddingham, I mean, is this a sign of the end times? What is there to say about this?
Do I really have to comment on this?
Yeah, you do. You do. That's the rules.
The article posits that the characters, the Pez dispenser characters in this film, will be actual Pez dispensers, and in between saying their lines, they will be dispensing Pezes, which would certainly be entertaining. I think it'll just be a really boring, not very good mixed IP cartoon.
I just want that to be true. I want it to be this kind of cinema verite thing of these dilapidated plastic Pez dispensers that just sort of spit out a desultory treat every 2 minutes. This is just the most... It's not even... The thing is that Pez is not even an IP. It's like a meta IP. It's a container. It's literally and figuratively a container of other things. I don't even know how you license that, because they don't even have... they don't have the Disney licenses for these things that you have that Goofy's head and you press it and...
Maybe within some very narrow bounds they do, and as long as the thing looks enough like a Pez dispenser, they can use Mickey's face. I mean, the thing that probably upsets me most about this entire thing is that I think it's very likely that the characters in the show will eat Pezes to get power of some kind, which is just an unacceptable reversal of what Pez dispensing is actually about.
It's about taking power away from corporations. I think what happened is this is a scam, and they had a meeting, and the guy turned up with this briefcase full of Pez dispensers, and he opened it, and they've got all Sonic the Hedgehog and all these things. And we can license this to you, and you can make a movie. And they're writing down all the characters, and it turns out they've just licensed the plastic inhaler thing, and they had to announce it as part of the deal. And
I like it. I think that's a good idea.
Right, and now it's time for Ian's entirely inexplicable rundown of the games that were released this week in 2005 thanks to Eurogamer. Take it away, Ian.
Hello. welcome to the games that were released this year in 2005. Well, 10 years ago, which this year is 2005. So, Paul, are you ready for this list?
I am.
We have Herbie Fully Loaded on the Game Boy Advance.
Mm-hmm.
We have Steel Empire on the Game Boy Advance.
Mm-hmm.
We have Animaniacs on the Game Boy Advance. We have Animaniacs on the Nintendo DS. And we have 2 PC games, Aurora Watching and International Cricket Captain Ashes Year 2005. So, what do I have to say about this? I'm really surprised that there are still Game Boy Advance games being released at this time in my life. I guess, as we're seeing with Animaniacs, this is the time when the DS is slowly taking over.
Yeah.
This was probably the time where everyone still thought the DS was a massive failure.
I think you're probably right there. I mean, as usual, I have very little to say about this. Well, I don't know what... I mean, so... there must be so many people whose, like, their first game they worked on was, like, Herbie Fully Loaded. And then they get asked that question in an interview and they have to say, oh, it was Herbie Fully Loaded. And nobody can even remember that the Herbie film came... I mean, this is the Herbie film with Lindsay Lohan, I'm presuming. Cause there
I think you're right about that.
Right. So nobody... Only I remember that happened, for one thing. I mean, so we have that, and then we have these games, like, there are other games lost to the sands of time, like, what is Aurora Watching? Do you even know what that is?
It rings only the faintest of bells. I can tell you that Steel Empire was originally a pretty well-regarded Mega Drive game, and actually one of the Mega Drive games that I most lusted after a Mega Drive 4, when I had a review of it in a magazine, and I kept reading it because it had such beautiful graphics. So I have a connection to that, and maybe I'll dust off my Game Boy Advance and play it now.
Do you remember what kind of game that was?
Yeah, it's side-scrolling shooter.
Oh, okay.
As in, like, you were playing as a blimp, which I thought was charmingly unusual,
Wow.
not like an
Okay.
F-15.
Yeah.
And it sort of had a lot of bullet hell kind of things, and it looked great. And I don't know if the Game Boy Advance version was any good. The first few games that I worked on when I was coming up were all Game Boy Advance games. So I have some of that thing that you were talking about. I worked on Midnight Club on Game Boy Advance. That was pretty good.
Yeah, I think the Game Boy Advance was a very fertile time for shovelware. There was a lot of low-tier Game Boy Advance stuff. Not that I'm saying that Herbie Fully Loaded is necessarily shovelware, but it was a fertile time. That's enough of that. Right, we're rocketing into the present now, and you'll understand why that's funny in a moment, because here's this week's top 5 bestsellers on Steam. At number 5, we've got Ark Survival Evolved. We talked about that last week. Number 4, we've got Savage Lands. Number 3, we've got GTA 5. Number 2, we've got Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. And number 1, we have Rocket League. Now, what strikes your fancy from this list?
As I mentioned earlier, I played Rocket League for the first time last night, and I think it's great.
Good.
I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and I actually might start playing online. I think it's a brilliant game where you don't have to keep shooting at things, but you can like drive and then try and hit a ball, and it's just great. I like it a lot.
It is a truly fantastic game. I agreed with what you said earlier, which is that it's kind of, you don't want it to be this high skilled thing. It's the same thing that kind of Alec Meir said. It's kind of, it's fun when nobody's good. I played online straight away because I'm the kind of person that does that, because I like ruining everyone else's game so that I can have fun.
Yes, you
and
do.
The general level of play is very bad, so that's actually good, and that will obviously change over time. But yeah, it is great to see it at number 1 on Steam. Like, a lot of these kind of very momentary successes get into the top 5, but they don't hit the top spot, so congratulations to those guys.
I think that it's really been helped by being free on PlayStation Plus and being a big console hit as well. I think it's sort of keeping it in the news cycle. I think Rocket League has stayed in the news cycle for longer than a lot of games recently.
Yes, it has. PS Plus has been a big factor in that. Also, they've done very well with their servers, and their online stuff is very robust. It's very easy to get a game. I've never had a server-related issue, even with a stupid number of players online. So it shows a bit of experience. It's a very polished game. Very, very clear that the devs have some solid experience. So lots of good things to say about Rocket League. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain at number 2. As a pre-order... Now, there's a lot of chat about pre-orders, and I can understand when something like this happens why people get so irritated about it. It just seems crazy that this game that isn't out yet is number 2.
I'm a little surprised by that, because obviously Metal Gear Solid is a ginormous IP. I didn't actually think it had quite that much power on the PC. So to be the second biggest seller when it hasn't even out yet is pretty impressive. And then
GTA 5, getting an update is the reason that it's in the charts. So, I mean, fair enough. Savage Lands, this is an early access title at 60% off, and it's another survival game.
That's just where the money on Steam is right now.
It is, and it's got some sort of slight... I think graphically it looks quite nice, but I'm completely bewildered by all these games. I can't... As soon as I see what it is, my brain shuts down, and I can't... people are saying more interesting things about Ark, which again has had an update and has just come off sale, so it's kind of back in the top 5. But this is the era of survival, and there's nothing that we can do about it.
Yeah, I'm big into 2D survival / building, like Spacebound and Terraria. I'm big into those, and if I see a really interesting new version of that, I may buy it straight away. I haven't really got into the 3D ones yet. I might try Ark, although I kind of want to wait till they're finished, which doesn't appear to be the way you do things with this kind of game.
No, none of these games are ever finished. That's the end of that. Now it's time for your questions, and we're going to start with a serious question from Alex Connolly, our endless supply of serious questions from him. Thank you very much. And he says, will the arcade racer return? This has kind of been spurred by things like Drift Stage, I guess stuff like Oh Dear, which are things that use the kind of classic Outrun rendering. There have been more arcade racers. I'm going to say that I think this is a momentary fad, actually. Like, I think we're going to see a few of these games come out now. The reason it's happened is because it was a kind of untapped reserve of retro gaming kind of copyingness, and we're steadily ploughing through every possible one of those. So I don't think this is going to be a long-lasting thing, because I don't think a lot of those games were that good, is my opinion.
I really dislike arcade racers. I think Wipeout is unbelievably boring and just sort of linear in a really annoying way for me. Like, it doesn't do anything for me at all. F-Zero X is about the only thing that you could even plausibly call an arcade racer that I like. And it's quite an interactive one. So I'm going to vote no on this one, and apologies to all the Wipeout fans out there.
I think I'm with you. I'm going to say no. And finally, we have a question from Great Neon Sage. I asked for questions on Twitter, and he said, why are people fucking with all these fancy pizza flavours? And I don't know. I mean, I guess it's just a sign of the times. I guess people want variety now, and they don't know what's good for them. They're not willing to just trust tradition for their pizza experience. They feel the need to go out and explore new territory.
I'm a traditional pizza eater, but food is getting fancier. It's not just pizza.
Yeah,
everything's getting deluxe versions. Are we gonna have like an 18 rating on iTunes just because of Great Neon Sage's question?
We already have one,
no.
just in case one of us says something incorrect.
Oh, that's right.
So
I used
felt
the S
like
word last week.
Exactly, I felt like making the most of it. So thanks, Great Neon Sage, for that one. We're making the most use of Apple's censorship policies.
We would really like some more sensible questions, guys. If anyone could find a good question to ask us, it could be about our own games. You can ask us embarrassing questions about our games or other people's games, but some more questions would be good.
Otherwise, it's just going to be Alex Connolly, and he already puts a lot of effort in every week. So, Alex, we are relying on you to, even Great Neon Sage. If you want to come back, I enjoyed that question. I'm happy to take questions like that. So
I'll let him improve. I'll let him evolve his questioning.
Okay. Well, maybe he'll be so rewarded by our thorough and considered answer to his question that he will come back next week. I think we have to wrap it up, unless there's anything else you want to say.
There is literally nothing else.
Fantastic. Well, then, please join us next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.